Greiner Talks, about sustainability and transformation. A Greiner podcast episode.
This is Greiner Talks, our podcast about sustainability and transformation. How to change, how to become a sustainable business. That is what we are discussing here. I'm Alexander, I'm part of the sustainability team at Greiner, and I'm very happy to be here in Nairobi, sitting next to a very special guest today. She is the Vice President and Regional Director for Africa at the World Resources Institute. She is a Senior Advisor to the Global Restoration Initiative. She is deeply involved in the Green Belt movement. And foremost, she is an environmentalist and an activist. Very warm welcome to you, Wanjira Mathai.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks for having me.
And thanks for hosting me here at the United Nations in Nairobi and for finding a space for this interview.
I know, it's a beautiful place. It's a nice place to be.
It's very green on the outside, lots of plants and trees, and I think that's something you have a very deep connection to.
Yeah, I love that. You know that. Yes, absolutely.
Wanjira, you are the Africa Director of the World Resources Institute. And my question to you is, in your perspective, is the world dealing with its resources in a proper way?
Well, no. And I think it's the reason we have such suffering around the world. We have such pain. The world is not dealing with resources fairly. There's a lot of injustice in the distribution of resources, in the use of resources. And yes, that's problematic.
You're speaking of justice or injustice already in your answer. That is one of my questions, that a very, very small share of people, like 1% of people, own 99% of the world's wealth. How do you think can we ever create a just society if wealth is distributed so unfairly?
I think it's more what happens to that wealth. I actually have less of a problem with who holds the wealth and more with who else other than themselves are the beneficiaries of that wealth. I think there's a moral obligation to ensure that there's no suffering in this world. There's enough for everyone's need, as Gandhi told us, but not enough for everyone's greed. And so there's definitely an opportunity for people to engage, to support, to ensure that they're not the only beneficiaries of the gifts that they've been given.
While being here in Nairobi, I met with many activists from Fridays for Future, Blue Earth Foundation, Kenyan Environment Action Network. So there's so many NGOs doing a great job here. And there was one term that I heard quite a few times. It's Mapa, most affected people and areas. Can you give me some insight? What does Mapa mean in the African context?
Well, most affected people and areas is a concept that to me also reflects the vulnerability. When we're talking about any issues of economic injustice, issues of climate injustice, those who suffer the most, those who are disproportionately affected even if they haven't caused the problem, those ought to be the focus of our work. And that's why I think this idea of inclusive transformation is so important. We could transform people's lives and leave a lot of people behind. But the idea is that we be inclusive, and then we are all safe, because we are definitely not safe if only a few of us are doing well and a large majority are not.
And that reminds me of a visit to the Dandora dump site that I did the other day. And I think that showed in a very, very special, peculiar way of what problems we are facing. It is a problem about poverty. It was an ecological problem. It's a political problem, a structural problem. This place for me described like so many things that are going wrong. How do you perceive that situation on the example of Dandora?
Well, I think you're right. I think it is a symbol of so much that is broken. And the prosperity of Kenyans ought to touch enough people. The waste disposal, the fact that we waste so much, and the absence of circularity. I was just saying to you that when I grew up, there was a very vibrant waste management system. I remember we used to call the Shubanandebe, the bottle and tins guy would come around and collect old newspapers, tins and bottles. There's a culture already as a child that I know of glass and tins and recycling of those. it just is not the case. So we have more people, and when I was young, we have more waste being produced, but we've lost that sense of circularity.
And while you're saying that, I think there's probably being some waste unloaded out there if you hear some background noise.
I do, yeah, it's probably so.
But that was here in Nairobi.
That was here in Nairobi, yeah.
It's very, very hard to believe, and it's very sad to see that systems can not only positively develop, but also the other way.
And disappear.
You were speaking about climate justice. How can we, as a European company, a society, contribute to climate justice? Because obviously, as you have mentioned, we are not very much affected by climate change. We are affected, but definitely not as much as people in the global south.
Right. Well, I think there's a lot of things people can do. First of all, in appreciating the injustice in climate is really important. The fact that those who suffer most from the growth and prosperity of the North and G20 really, even maybe G7, are those in climate vulnerable spaces and people who really have now to marshal everything they have and build adaptation, build resilience within their societies for a reason beyond their own control. I think the fact that vulnerability is such a function of economic impoverishment is important, that we've got to invest, companies like you, investing in the economies of countries that are vulnerable, making sure that we build real wealth in those countries. Because as soon as people have a certain amount of economic capacity, they can build resilience. I was struck by the latest report from the IPCC, the one that's basically has underscored how that we are actually in a worse place with respect to vulnerability and climate impacts than we thought, and that people living in climate vulnerable countries are 15 times more vulnerable than people in the same exposure living in the rich economies. That's absolutely deplorable. How on earth is it possible for someone in the Netherlands who is exposed to sea level rise, more exposure to sea level rise and the risks associated with it than people living in Bangladesh, but they're 15 more times protected than those in Bangladesh? Therein lies the injustice. And underlying all of that is that we invest in the prosperity agenda for those countries. Poverty is the biggest Achilles heel for all of them.
So economic growth is very important if we want to achieve sustainable development, if I understand you correctly.
Absolutely.
At the same time, we are facing a finite amount of resources on our planet. How does that go together? On the one hand, we should grow. We want to grow economically. On the other hand, we want sustainability. We have a planet with limited resources. Isn't that a contradiction?
Well, we can grow in different ways. I don't think we have any room for the old high polluting, high carbonizing growth models of the past. But we have great opportunities in green, clean growth models that are more attuned to the environment, more attuned to resource use, better sources of energy. We know that coal is gone. At least it's on its way out for those who are awake. But we have to now start looking at the role of renewables and, of course, investing in those renewables. But even within that context is understanding that for Africa, there is, for example, a huge deficit in energy access. We need to invest in the energy access agenda. 600 million people don't have access to energy for lighting. It's unacceptable. So we've got to make the just transition a huge priority in the climate agenda, that people get access to energy, yes, for lighting, but also to power industry. Those industries have to be new sorts of industries, of course, but they have to be powered. Not one country in this planet has developed without access to energy.
And existing industries like the plastics industry, plastics and foam industry, have to transform themselves. Otherwise, we will not reach that transition that you're speaking about.
Absolutely. And they have to transform themselves and be honest with themselves that they transform in the same way everywhere. There is a perception that a lot of companies in the North are willing to dump what is not good and substandard in the South. They need to be a little bit more responsibility and accountability around that you cannot waste and dump in one place, but when you're at home, you're responsible. So it's that sort of solidarity that's also important.
two of the main goals we have as a company is to become climate neutral by 2030, at least when it comes to scope 1 and 2 emissions, and to be fully circular by 2030. Because without circularity, I think we will not solve plastic pollution.
No, we can't, because we know just how important plastics as a polymer, as a material is for our lives. I mean, we rely on plastics more than we know. I think there's, when you talk about plastics, there's what is obvious, and then there's so much. You were talking about medical supplies. People don't even realize foam is of plastic. All of those wonderful inventions. However, how we use them, what we do with them once we've used them, and how they make it back into the system is crucial, because we are now finding out we do not have finite space on this planet. We've exhausted our ability to dump.
So we need a lot of changes, and they should happen pretty soon. Do you think it's going quick enough?
Of course not, because there is not a genuine commitment. There is a lot more commitment to business as usual. There needs to be a lot more accountability from the private sector to do what they're saying. We know that, for example, the GFANs, the banks that made a commitment in Glasgow to invest in climate-friendly, put significant resources in climate, are already, some of them, investing in coal. An expansion of coal. That is insincere. We've got to see an end to that, and we need more accountability, a lot more pressure from their peers to make sure that we stay on course.
We are here in Nairobi, which is home to the United Nations Environment Programme. And over the last few days, a resolution on plastics pollution has been negotiated here. I'd like to know from you, Wanjira, is that the milestone that we were waiting for when it comes to plastic pollution? Or is it simply another treaty that will be followed by endless discussions?
Well, I hope not. I think we know better now. We actually are better informed. We are seeing devastation around us. We are living in a pandemic situation already, and many of us just struggling. It's been miserable 2 years just figuring out how to be human in a situation that is so restricted. So yeah, I think we ought to take it seriously. I hope we do. I think the fact that the resolution passed is a good symbol.
You are working with youth, you're working with development, with sustainability. I'd like to know from you, what are you most passionate about? What is your heart beating for? What motivates you?
I'm motivated by the potential for us to really transform the lives of Africans today. The fact that we have within our grasp the tools, the knowledge, sometimes the will to bring about real transformation. Because if we don't get rid of poverty, which is SDG number 1, we can almost forget the rest. Because the underlying driver of vulnerability is poverty. And we've got to get to that. So that's why I wake up every morning believing that we have the tools, we can transform, we can protect our landscapes around the world. The Congo forest being one of the most healthy. These forests are the source, my mother used to say, of everything that's good. Air, water, food. So all of that interdependencies with our landscapes, restoring the degradation of those landscapes becomes another piece of work that we have to do. Because as we know, the pollution levels on this planet are getting to a place that is extremely difficult. We're seeing levels of asthma so high because of outdoor air pollution. So we've got to restore as much as we can and increase the capacity of our planet to sustain the balance that it needs. Then, of course, we have to reduce the amount of waste. We're talking about circularity right now. And of course, we have to produce things and produce food and everything more sustainably as we increase production. So more effectively, but more sustainably.
And you have mentioned your mother, Wangari Maathai. She is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. She has won the Alternative Nobel Prize. She has started the Green Belt movement. Everybody in Africa knows her. That's my perception. Could you explain to our listeners who might not know Wangari Maathai, who was she and what did she do in her life?
Well, they need to go and read her book, Unbowed, by Wangari Maathai. She was a great African environmentalist. She was committed to grassroots action. She believed that each of us could be potent agents of change. And she herself was a great example of that. And we have so many things to thank her for here in Kenya, for the forests and parks and green spaces that we still have in our cities that are some of the largest on the continent. And just believing that you're never too small to make a difference.
That's a very nice message. And I would like to ask you another question that is related to your mother. There is one very special tree here in Nairobi. It is a fig tree. Could you share the story around that tree?
Yes, this fig tree that is in Westlands and a part of Nairobi that is quite central. And as we have seen the development of an expressway going across close to 60 to 100 kilometers from the airport on out, it was passing through. And one of the most painful things about the development of this expressway, and I don't know if we'll ever understand whether this was really the best thing for our city, over 3,000 trees were cut to make way for this expressway. My impression is what we really need in this city is non-motorized transit, the ability for people to walk safely, to ride their bicycles safely across Nairobi, the ability of us to have mass transit. I dream of my Nairobi when I was a child, when we actually did have bus transit. My mother would put me on the bus and I would go to school and I would come back on my own because the buses were safe. That entire bus and non-motorized transit is being replaced by our ability to move cars very fast and far across our city and at the expense of the environment. It is an absolute sad shame that we are doing that to our cities. And Nairobi is a pretty green city and we are always hoping it stays that way. But adjacent to that highway was this massive, over 100 years old, I think it's actually more than 200 or 300 years old, fig tree that I actually grew up seeing as a child. And when we heard that that tree was going to go down as part of this what seemed like a very senseless cutting of thousands of trees along the highway, we decided to rally. The Wangari Maathai Foundation has a campaign and campaigns that are led by youth. I really believe in youth activism. And these young people decided that this tree would not go, that they can cut everything they want, but this one we shall fight for. And they did. They rallied, they came to that tree, they sat on the tree, they sat around the tree until the president gave it presidential protection. And I think it remains a symbol of persistence, it remains a symbol of resistance, but it's also just a symbol. In many ways, it's just one solitary tree, but it's a massive tree. It's a beautiful tree. Every time we go, we were there yesterday, it's a stunning tree. And that tree was the only thing that we felt in many ways was the hope, the window of hope remaining that our city will not lose every tree in sight. I always wonder who sits down and plans these things and decides we shall cut every last thing on the way. It's like, why? In other cities around the world, progressive cities, they're tearing down the very same highways to put parks and walkways. It's very difficult. I live about 5 minutes away from Westlands if I could walk in a straight line. But I almost can't walk because there's nowhere to really walk without being dangerously, and I dangerously cross the street. But I wish there was a way my children could walk and ride their bikes, and everybody's kids in this city, without the risk of being run over by something.
Wanjira, I would love to ask many more questions, but we're slowly coming to an end of the conversation. But finally, I'd like to invite you to do a short word rap with me, if that's fine for you.
Okay.
I will give you one word, and you can reply with whatever comes to your mind. That can be one word, one sentence, one story, whatever.
Okay.
So the first one is green belt.
Movement.
Nairobi.
Is green.
Paris.
Is beautiful.
Plastic pollution.
Sucks.
Africa.
The beautiful.
And last but not least, your message to the world.
Well, invest in Africa, invest in Africa's youth, invest in youth everywhere. They are the real drivers of the future.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation and for hosting me here in Nairobi.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And thank you everybody for listening to this podcast. Make sure to read the book that Wanjira has suggested. follow us on Spotify, look up all the things we discussed in this podcast today, and thank you for listening. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.
Greiner Talks, a Greiner podcast. Subscribe now.